before we jump into our primary topic, Martin, can you tell us about our module of the week?
Thanks, John. I thought this week we would talk about the JSON API Search API module, which allows your headless Drupal site to also provide a search service. So it's a module that was created in November of 2019, and the current version is 8.x-1.0- release candidate 3, which came out in January, so just over a month ago, and that release added Drupal 10 readiness. It has 25 open bugs, 25 open issues, 12 of which are bugs, and is currently in use by just over 700 sites. Now, it's a module that is supported by Centauro, and the current maintainer, Jay Saxic, works for them. But the module was originally created by Matt Glayman, who has been a host on this show a number of times already. So in terms of the way JSON API, Search API works, it really provides or exposes, I guess you would say, the Search API as kind of a JSON API endpoint. So instead of using kind of a dedicated service like Algolia, like many headless websites will do, it allows you to use a custom route that can be used for sort of full text and filter queries, so that you can really create sort of the standard result or search results experience that you would be used to with sort of a more traditional or unified architecture in a Drupal website. Because it leverages Search API, you can use it with either like your local database, a Solr or Elastic search core, and really anything that Search API has a connector for. It also does have support for facets, and it's probably also worth mentioning that an alternative module you could look at is something called Solrest, which more or less uses Drupal as kind of a pass-through directly to Solr to send queries, but obviously that solution is more specific to Solr itself. So anyone have any thoughts about JSON API, Search API?
I've not used it. Yeah, I've not used it myself, but I mean, Search API is definitely one of the cornerstones of complex Drupal sites. So having the ability to kind of use that with whatever backend, Elasticsearch or Solr or whatever, and kind of interact with this on the front end is super powerful, I think.
I could take a slightly different approach because, like, you bring up Algolia, and I'm using Coveo, which is another search provider. And something that more modern search providers or services are doing is APIs. And so this is proxying through to, if you had an Algolia backend conceptually, and by the way, I think for example, the Search API Algolia module has no front end. All it's there for is indexing data. And then the assumption is you're going to call their APIs directly. And in both Coveo and Algolia, from my experience, you'd benefit more calling them directly. You don't do the hop through, you get their full documentation, you get all their features. You might even get a slight performance gain because you're not proxying the request through Drupal. And the example would be they have load balance, like Algolia and Coveo have crazy load balance servers that are more performant than most Drupal sites. Sorry to say that, but they're probably more performant than
I've used Algolia on a front end, actually on a Drupal front end, and like it was lightning fast, and the API was really great to use. So I think like if you're using Algolia, like I happen to be an Algolia fanboy, so I mean like I'm a little bit partial, but I think where like this module kind of fits in is where you have Solr on your backend and you're building a headless site, right? So there are a lot of people that are doing that. Their hosting provider is providing them with Solr. It's built in, quote unquote, built in, right? This makes that connection a lot easier, and it essentially allows you to be able to index the site and use it similarly to Algolia as far as like, hey, we're going to have components on the front end pulling that data and doing stuff with it. But
does Solr provide APIs, or that's where we're getting into this difference here? Like I assume it provides APIs, but not API. I mean, Algolia is like API first. I mean, their whole business is API.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this would be like, hey, we indexed it. And then now like this module is providing APIs from Drupal to be able to use for the search front end. So like in that case, like we're removing like, with Algolia, like you get Algolia indexing and then organizing and providing the APIs and the functionality on top of that. So like, I think Algolia is replacing Solar in this use case.
Yeah. And one thing I will say that this module seems really good for is a lot of times people do overkill on search. Like you have a news page and you want to let people search news articles, and there's 1,000 news articles. The search is a keyword and that's it, or a facet. And this puts that layer in front that makes it a lot simpler. Like once you implement it, you don't have to think about your backend anymore. You could just literally change from one index to another. And I've worked at organizations that change their search index every few years. It happens pretty, outside of Drupal upgrades. It's just politics or,
right.
Try this, try that.
This also removes a little bit of a barrier too, I think, right? So like if you're thinking of moving from like a monolithic coupled solution to a headless solution, right? One of the factors you may be considering there is like, oh, we have we're using Solar and we have it tuned and configured exactly how we need it to. Like, how do we translate that to our headless front end? And this kind of helps remove that barrier, right? Because you can still index, have Solar index the way that it needs to, or Elasticsearch or whatever, whatever the search service is, and then still be able to provide this through API. Because I mean, that's the key here, right? Is like, hey, like that data needs to be available through an API. And like, we've already kind of harped on the fact that Algolia provides that out of the box, but like, if you didn't have the ability to, move to a service like Algolia, or didn't want to, because, you've spent the time, you've invested in Solar, right? This is, I feel like this is probably making that jump a little bit easier for folks.
I think the other thing maybe worth mentioning too is there's also added flexibility here, because Search API has such a rich ecosystem of modules there as well that, there's lots of, community provided modules, a couple of which we've actually talked about as module of the week already, that can be dropped into sort of, give some more nuances in terms of how those search results are returned.
That actually raises another question for me, Martin. Is this JSON API integration work with like, one of the things that I do fairly often with Search API when I'm exposing that to clients or to end users rather, is create a view that searches a specific index or a specific facet. Does it work off of those as well? Like if you create a view, does it give an endpoint for that view to hit on a particular page? Or are you doing all that logic on the front end? Like if you want a particular search field to search just newsletters, like Jacob said, or news articles, are you doing that all on the front end with just kind of like facets, or are you able to build that in Drupal and just request an endpoint?
So my understanding is that it has facet support, but I don't know that it really is specific to a view in the same way that a traditional architecture would be. So it sounds like in that kind of a use case, you would probably have to do a little bit more of the work on your own in terms of how you get that query built.
Yeah, the README has the most documentation, and it's all index based. It's basically taking the index entity, the Search API index entity, and exposing it through the JSON API, and then just allowing filters. And I think that makes sense. It's like keeping the scope of this module very focused. And views, you can expose views to APIs. I don't necessarily think it's JSON API compatible, but you can just take a view and just add like a JSON endpoint to return data sets.
Yep. Which is probably how people were doing it before, but this gives more flexibility. Awesome.
All right. Well, as always, Martin, thank you. And now on to our primary topic, which